Reading The Birth of Biopolitics, lectures by Michel Foucault, 1978 through 79. This is lecture number 2 on 17th of January 1979. I would like to refine a little the thesis or hypothesis that I put forward last week, and with regard to what I think is a new art of government that began to be formulated, reflected upon, and outlined around the middle of the 18th century. I think an essential characteristic of this new art of government is the organization of numerous and complex internal mechanisms whose function, and this is what distinguishes them from raison d'etat, is not so much to ensure the growth of the state's forces, wealth, and strength, to ensure its unlimited growth, as to limit the exercise of government power internally. This art of government is certainly new in its mechanisms, its effects, and its principle. But it is so only up to a point, because we should not imagine that this art of government is the suppression, obliteration, abolition, or, if you prefer, the Aufhebung of the raison d'etat I tried to talk about last week. In fact, we should not forget that this new art of government, or this art of the least possible government, this art of governing between a maximum and minimum, and rather minimum than maximum, should be seen as a sort of intensification or internal refinement of raison d'etat. It is a principle for maintaining it, developing it more fully, and perfecting it. It is not something other than raison d'etat, an element external to and in contradiction with raison d'etat, but rather its point of inflection in the curve of its development. If you like, to use a not very satisfactory expression, I would say that it is the reason of the least state within and as organizing principle of raison d'etat itself. Or again, it is the reason of least government as the principle organizing raison d'etat itself. There is someone, unfortunately I've not been able to find his name in my papers, but when I do I will tell you, but certainly from the end of the 18th century, who spoke about frugal government. Well, I think that actually at this moment we are entering what could be called the epoch of frugal government, which is, of course, not without a number of paradoxes, since during this period of frugal government, which was inaugurated in the 18th century and is no doubt still not behind us, we see both the intensive and extensive development of governmental practice, along with the negative effects, with the resistances and revolts which we know are directed precisely against the invasive intrusions of a government which nevertheless claims to be and is supposed to be frugal. Let's say, and this will be why we can say that we are living in the age of frugal government, that this extensive and intensive development of a government that is nevertheless supposed to be frugal has been constantly accompanied outside and within government by the question of the too much and the too little, stretching things and giving a caricature of them. I would say that whatever the extension and intensive development of government there may be, in fact, the question of frugality has been at the very heart of the reflection which has revolved around government. The question of frugality has, if not replaced, at least overtaken, and to an extent forced back and somewhat marginalized, a different question which preoccupied political reflection in the 16th and 17th centuries, and even up to the start of the 18th century, which was the problem of the Constitution. Certainly, all the questions concerning monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy do not disappear. But just as they were the fundamental questions, I was going to say the royal questions, in the 17th and 18th centuries. So starting from the end of the 18th century, throughout the 19th century, and obviously more than ever today, the fundamental problem is not the constitution of states, but without a doubt the question of the frugality of government. The question of the frugality of government is indeed the question of liberalism. I would now like to take up 2 or 3 of the points I mentioned last week in order to clarify and refine them. Last week, I tried to show you that this idea, this theme, or this regulative principle, rather, of frugal government was formed on the basis of what could be called, or what I roughly designated as, the connecting up of raison d'etat and its calculation with a particular regime of truth that finds its theoretical expression and formulation in political economy, I tried to suggest that the appearance of political economy and the problem of least government were linked. But I think we should try to be a bit clearer about the nature of this connection. When I say connecting up of political economy with raison d'etat, does this mean that political economy put forward a particular model of government? Does it mean that statesmen were initiated into political economy, or that they began to listen to the economists? Did the economic model become the organizing principle of governmental practice? Clearly, this is not what I wanted to say. What I meant, what I tried to designate, was something of a rather different nature and situated at a different level. The principle of this connection between the practice of government and a regime of truth that I tried to identify would be this. There was something in the regime of government, in the governmental practice of the 16th century and 17th centuries, and already of the Middle Ages also, that was one of the privileged objects of governmental intervention and regulation. That was the privileged object of government vigilance and intervention. And it is not economic theory, but this place itself that from the 18th century became a site and a mechanism of the formation of truth. And instead of continuing to saturate this site of the formation of truth with an unlimited regulatory governmentality, it is recognized, and this is where the shift takes place, that it must be left to function with the least possible interventions, precisely so that it can be both formulate its truth and propose it to governmental practice as rule and norm. This site of truth is not in the heads of economists, of course, but it is the market. Let's put it more clearly. The market, in the very general sense of the word, as it operated in the Middle Ages and in the 16th and 17th centuries, was, in a word, essentially a site of justice. In what sense was it a site of justice? In several senses. In the first place, it was, of course, invested with extremely prolific and strict regulations. It was regulated with regard to the objects brought to market, their type of manufacture, their origin, the duties to be paid, the procedures of sale, and, of course, the prices fixed. So, the market was a site invested with regulations. It was also a site of justice, in the sense that the sale price fixed in the market was seen, both by theorists and in practice, as a just price, or at any rate a price that should be the just price. That is to say, a price that was to have a certain relationship with work performed, with the needs of the merchants, and, of course, with the consumer's needs and possibilities. The market was a site of justice to such an extent that it had to be a privileged site of distributive justice, since, as you know, for at least some basic products, like food products, the rules of the market operated to ensure that, if not all, then at least some of the poorest could buy things as well as those who were more well off. So, in this sense, the market was a site of distributive justice. Finally, what was it that essentially had to be ensured in the market, by the market, or rather by the regulations of the market, and which makes it a site of justice? Was it the truth of prices, as we would say now? Not at all. What had to be ensured was the absence of fraud. In other words, it was the protection of the buyer. The aim of the regulation of the market was, on the one hand, a distribution of goods that was as just as possible, and then, on the other hand, the absence of theft and crime. In other words, the market was basically seen at this time as a risk, maybe for the merchant, but certainly for the buyer. The buyer had to be protected against the danger of bad goods and the fraud of the person selling them. It was necessary then to ensure the absence of fraud, and with regard to the nature of the objects, their quality, and so forth. This system, regulation, this just price, the sanction of fraud, thus meant that the market was essentially, and really functioned as, a site of justice, a place where what had to appear in exchange and be formulated in the price was justice. Let's say that the market was a site of jurisdiction. Now, this is where the change takes place for a number of reasons that I will mention shortly. In the middle of the 18th century, the market no longer appeared as, or rather no longer had to be a site of jurisdiction. On the one hand, the market appeared as something that obeyed and had to obey natural, that is to say, spontaneous mechanisms. Even if it is not possible to grasp these mechanisms in their complexity, their spontaneity is such that attempts to modify them will only impair and distort them. On the other hand, and this is the second sense in which the market becomes a site of truth, not only does it allow natural mechanisms to appear, but when you allow these natural mechanisms to function, they permit the formation of a certain price that Bois-Guilbert will call the natural price. The physiocrats will call the good price, and that will later be called the normal price. That is to say, a certain price, natural, good, normal, it's not important, which will adequately express the relationship, a definite, adequate relationship between the cost of production and the extent of demand. When you allow the market to function by itself according to its nature, according to its natural truth, if you like, it permits the formation of a certain price which will be called, metaphorically, the true price, and which will still sometimes be called the just price, but which no longer has any connotations of justice. It is a certain price that fluctuates around the value of the product. The importance of economic theory, I mean the theory constructed in the discourse of the economists and formed in their brains, the importance of the theory of the price-value relationship is due precisely to the fact that it enables economic theory to pick out something that will become fundamental, that the market must be that which reveals something like a truth. This does not mean that prices are, in the strict sense, true, and that there are true prices and false prices. But what is discovered at this moment, at once in governmental practice and in reflection on this governmental practice, is that inasmuch as prices are determined in accordance with the natural mechanisms of the market, they constitute a standard of truth which enables us to discern which governmental practices are correct and which are erroneous. In other words, it is the natural mechanism of the market and the formation of a natural price that enables us to falsify and verify governmental practice when, on the basis of these elements, we examine what government does, the measures it takes, and the rules it imposes. In this sense, inasmuch as it enables production, need, supply, demand, value, and price, etc., to be linked together through exchange, the market constitutes a site of veridiction. I mean a site of verification / falsification for governmental practice. Consequently, the market determines that good government is no longer simply government that functions according to justice. The market determines that a good government is no longer quite simply one that is just. The market now means that to be good government, government has to function according to truth. In this history and formation of a new art of government, political economy does not therefore owe its privileged role to the fact that it will dictate a good type of conduct to government. Political economy was important, even in its theoretical formulation, inasmuch as, and only as inasmuch as, but this is clearly a great deal, it pointed out to government where it had to go to find the principle of truth of its own governmental practice. In simple and barbaric terms, let's say that from being a site of jurisdiction, which it remained up to the start of the 18th century, the market, through all the techniques I discussed last year with regard to scarcity and grain markets, etc., is becoming what I will call a site of veridiction, The market must tell the truth, dire la vraie. It must tell the truth in relation to governmental practice, henceforth, and merely secondarily. It is its role of veridiction that will command, dictate, and prescribe the jurisdictional mechanisms or absence of such mechanisms on which the market must be articulated. When I spoke of the coupling carried out in the 18th century between a regime of truth and a new governmental reason and the connection of this with political economy, in no way did I mean that there was the formation of a scientific and theoretical discourse of political economy on one side, and then, on the other, those who governed who were either seduced by this political economy or forced to take it into account by the pressure of this or that social group. What I meant was that the market, which had been the privileged object of governmental practice for a very long time, and continued to be in the 16th and 17th centuries under the regime of raison d'etat, and a mercantilism which precisely made commerce one of the major instruments of the state's power, was now constituted as a site of veridiction. And this is not simply or so much because we have entered the age of market economy. This is at once true and says nothing exactly. And it is not because people wanted to produce the rational theory of the market, which is what they did, but it was not sufficient. In fact, in order to reach an understanding of how the market in its reality became a site of veridiction for governmental practice, we would have to establish what I would call a polygonal or polyhedral relationship between the particular monetary situation of the 18th century, with a new influx of gold on the one hand, and a relative consistency of currencies on the other, a continuous economic and demographic growth in the same period, an intensification of agricultural production, the access to governmental practice of a number of technicians who brought with them both methods and instruments of reflection, and finally, a number of economic problems being given a theoretical form. In other words, I do not think we need to look for, and consequently, I do not think we can find the cause of the constitution of the market as an agency of veridiction. If we want to analyze this absolutely fundamental phenomenon in the history of Western governmentality, this eruption of the market as a principle of veridiction, we should simply establish the intelligibility of this process by describing the connections between the different phenomena I have just referred to. This would involve showing how it became possible, that is to say, not showing that it was necessary, which is a futile task anyway, nor showing that it is a possibility, one possibility in a determinate field of possibilities. Let's say that what enables us to make reality intelligible is simply showing that it was possible. Establishing the intelligibility of reality consists in showing its possibility. Speaking in general terms, let's say that in this history of a jurisdictional and then veridictional market, we have one of those innumerable intersections between jurisdiction and veridiction that is undoubtedly a fundamental phenomenon in the history of the modern West. It has been around these questions that I have tried to organize a number of problems. With regard to madness, for example, the problem was not to show that psychiatry was formed in the heads of psychiatrists as a theory or science or discourse claiming scientific status, and that this was concretized or applied in psychiatric hospitals. Nor was it to show how, at a certain moment, institutions of confinement, which have existed for a long time, secreted their own theory and justifications in the discourse of psychiatrists. The problem was the genesis of psychiatry on the basis of, and through institutions of confinement that were originally and basically articulated on mechanisms of jurisdiction in the very broad sense, since there were police types of jurisdictions. But for the present, at this level, it is not very important, in which at a certain point and in conditions that precisely had to be analyzed, were at the same time supported, relayed, transformed, and shifted by process of veridiction. In the same way, studying penal institutions meant studying them first of all as sites and forms where jurisdictional practice was predominant and we can say autocratic. It meant studying how a certain practice of veridiction was formed and developed in these penal institutions that were fundamentally linked to a jurisdictional practice, and how this veridictional practice, supported of course by criminology, psychology, and so on. But this is not what is essential, began to install the veridictional question at the very heart of modern penal practice, even to the extent of creating difficulties for its jurisdiction, which was the question of truth addressed to the criminal. Who are you? When penal practice replaced the question, what have you done, with the question, who are you? You see the jurisdictional function of the penal system being transformed or doubled or possibly undermined by the question of veridiction. In the same way, studying the genealogy of the object sexuality through a number of institutions meant trying to identify in things like confessional practices, spiritual direction, the medical relationship, and so on. The moment when the exchange and crossover took place between a jurisdiction of sexual relations, defining the permitted and the prohibited, and the veridiction of desire, in which the basic armature of the object, sexuality, currently appears. You can see that all these cases, whether it is the market, the confessional, the psychiatric institution, or the prison, involve taking up a history of truth under different angles, or rather, taking up a history of truth that is coupled from the start with a history of law, while the history of error linked to a history of prohibitions has been attempted fairly frequently. I would propose undertaking a history of truth coupled with a history of law. Obviously, a history of truth should not be understood in the sense of a reconstruction of the genesis of the true through the elimination or rectification of errors, nor a history of the true which would constitute a historical succession of rationalities established through the rectification or elimination of ideologies. Nor would this history of truth be the description of insular and autonomous systems of truth. It would involve the genealogy of regimes of veridiction, that is to say, the constitution of a particular right of truth on the basis of a legal situation, the law and truth relationship finding its privileged expression in discourse. The discourse in which law is formulated and in which what can be true or false is formulated. The regime of veridiction, in fact, is not a law of truth, but the set of rules enabling one to establish which statements in a given discourse can be described as true or false. Undertaking the history of regimes of veridiction and not the history of truth, the history of error, or the history of ideology, etc., obviously means abandoning once again that well-known critique of European rationality and its excesses, which has been constantly taken up in various forms since the beginning of the 19th century. From Romanticism to the Frankfurt School, what has always been called into question and challenged has been rationality, with the weight of power supposedly peculiar to it. Now, the critique of knowledge I would propose does not in fact consist in denouncing what is continually, I was going to say monotonously, oppressive under reason, for after all, Believe me, insanity, déraison, is just as oppressive. Nor would this political critique of knowledge consist in fleshing out the presumption of power in every truth affirmed. For again, believe me, there is just as much abuse of power in the lie or error. The critique I propose consists in determining under what conditions and with what effects a veridiction is exercised, that is to say, once again, a type of formulation falling under particular rules of verification and falsification. For example, when I say that critique would consist in determining under what conditions and with what effects a veridiction is exercised, you can see that the problem would not consist in saying, look how oppressive psychiatry is because it is false. Nor would it consist in being a little more sophisticated and saying, look how oppressive it is because it is true. It would consist in saying that the problem is to bring to light the conditions that had to be met for it to be possible to hold a discourse on madness. But the same would hold for delinquency and for sex. That can be true or false according to the rules of medicine, say, or of confession, psychology, or psychoanalysis. In other words, to have political significance, analysis does not have to focus on the genesis of truths or the memory of errors. What does it matter when a science began to tell the truth, recalling all the erroneous things that doctors have been able to say about sex or madness does a fat lot of good. I think that what is currently politically important is to determine the regime of veridiction established at a given moment that is precisely the one on the basis of which you can now recognize. For example, that doctors in the 19th century said so many stupid things about sex. What is important is the determination of the regime of veridiction that enabled them to say and assert a number of things as truths that it turns out we know now were perhaps not true at all. This is the point, in fact, where historical analysis may have a political significance. It is not so much the history of the true or the history of the false as the history of veridiction, which has a political significance. That is what I wanted to say regarding the question of the market, or let's say of the connecting up of a regime of truth to governmental practice. Now, let's consider the second question. the second point on which I would like to refine a little in what I said to you last week. I said, you recall, that governmentality in the regime of pure raison d'etat, or at least its tendency, was interminable, without an end. In a sense, governmentality was unlimited. This was precisely the main characteristic of what was called at the time police, and which at the end of the 18th century will be called, already with a backward glance, the police state. The police state is a government that merges with administration, that is entirely administrative, and an administration which possesses, which has behind it all the weight of a governmentality. I have tried to show how this complete governmentality, this governmentality with a tendency to be unlimited, had in fact not exactly a limit, but a counterweight in the existence of judicial institutions and magistrates, and in juridical discourses focusing precisely on the problem of the nature of the sovereign's right to exercise his power and the legal limits within which the sovereign's action can be inserted. So governmentality was not completely unbalanced and unlimited in raison d'etat, but there was a system of two parts relatively external to each other. I also pointed out that in the new system of governmental reason, perfected in the 18th century, frugal government, or the reason of the least state, entailed something very different. This was a limitation on the one hand, and an internal limitation on the other. Nevertheless, we should not think that the nature of this internal limitation is completely different from law. In spite of everything, it is always a juridical limitation. The problem being precisely how to formulate this limitation in legal terms in the regime of this new self-limiting governmental reason. As you can see, this is a different problem. In the old system of raison d'etat, there was a governmentality with its tendency to be unlimited on one side, and then a system of law opposing it from outside, but within concrete and well-known political limits. The contrast was between royal power on one side and those upholding the judicial institution on the other. In the new system, we are dealing with a different problem. How can the necessary self-limitation of governmentality be formulated in law without government being paralyzed? And also, and this is the real problem, without stifling the sight of truth which is exemplified by the market and which must be respected as such. In clear terms, the problem raised at the end of the 18th century is this: if there is a political economy, what is its corresponding public law? Or again, what basis can be found for the law that will structure the exercise of power by public authorities when there is at least one region, but no doubt others too, where government non-intervention is absolutely necessary, not for legal, but for factual reasons, or rather, for reasons of truth? Limited by respect for the truth, how will government be able to formulate this respect for truth in terms of laws which must be respected? After all, the fact that for a long time, until recently, faculties of law in France were also faculties of political economy, to the great discomfort of economists and jurists, is only the extension, no doubt excessive in historical terms, of an original fact, which was that you could not think of political economy, that is to say, the freedom of the market, without at the same time addressing the problem of public law, namely that of limiting the power of public authorities. A number of precise and concrete things are proof of this, moreover. After all, the first economists were at the same time jurists and people who addressed the problem of public law. Beccaria, for example, who was a theorist of public law, basically in the form of penal law, was also an economist. You only have to read The Wealth of Nations, and not even his other works, to see that the problem of public law runs through all of Adam Smith's work. Bentham, a public law theorist, was at the same time an economist and wrote books on political economy. In addition to these facts, which show the original link between the problem of political economy and the problem of limiting the power of public authorities, there is ample proof in the problems raised during the 19th and 20th centuries concerning economic legislation, the separation of government and administration, the constitution of administrative law, whether specific administrative courts are needed, and so on. So when I spoke last week of the self-limitation of governmental reason, I was not referring to a disappearance of law, but to the problem raised by the juridical limitation of an exercise of political power, which problems of truth were making it necessary to determine. I just finished cleaning out the water distiller. It wasn't pretty. Once you've cleaned out the tank, you let it run in sterilization mode for about 30 minutes. And it just completed the cycle, so in a short period of time, clean water will be flowing once again. Okay, so So there is a shift of the center of gravity of public law. The fundamental problem of public law will no longer be the foundation of sovereignty. The conditions of the sovereign's legitimacy, or the conditions under which the sovereign's rights can be exercised legitimately, as it was in the 17th and 18th centuries. The problem becomes how to set juridical limits to the exercise of power by a public authority. Schematically, we can say that at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, there were basically two ways of resolving this. The first I will call the axiomatic, juridico-deductive approach, which was, up to a point, the path taken by the French Revolution. We could also call it Rousseau's approach. In what does it consist? It does not start from government and its necessary limitation, but from law in its classical form. That is to say, it tries to define the natural or original rights that belong to every individual, and then to define under what conditions, for what reason, and according to what ideal or historical procedures a limitation or exchange of rights was accepted. It also consists in defining those rights one has agreed to cede, and those, on the other hand, for which no cession has been agreed, and which thus remain imprescriptible rights in all circumstances and under any possible government or political regime. Finally, On this basis, and only on this basis, having thus defined the division of rights, the sphere of sovereignty, and the limits of the right of sovereignty, you can then deduce from this only what we can call the bounds of governmental competence. But within the framework determined by the armature constituting sovereignty itself. In other words, put clearly and simply, this approach consists in starting from the rights of man in order to arrive at the limitation of governmentality by way of the constitution of the sovereign. I would say that, broadly speaking, this is the revolutionary approach. It is a way of posing right from the start the problem of legitimacy and the inalienability of rights through a sort of ideal or real renewal of society, the state, the sovereign, and government. Consequently, you can see that if historically and politically this is the revolutionary's approach, we can call it a retroactive or retroactionary approach, inasmuch as it consists in taking up the problem of public law that the jurists had constantly opposed to the raison d'etat of the 17th and 18th centuries. In this respect, there is continuity between the 17th century theorists of natural law and the jurists and legislators of the French Revolution. The other approach does not start from law, but from governmental practice itself. It starts from government practice and tries to analyze it in terms of the de facto limits that can be set to this governmentality. These de facto limits may derive from history, from tradition, or from an historically determined state of affairs. But they can and must also be determined as desirable limits, as it were, as the good limits to be established precisely in terms of the objectives of governmentality, of the objects with which it has to deal, of the country's resources, population, and economy, etc. In short, this approach consists in the analysis of government, its practice, its de facto limits, and its desirable limits. On this basis, it distinguishes those things it would be either contradictory or absurd for government to tamper with. Better still, and more radically, it distinguishes those things that it would be pointless for government to interfere with. Following this approach means that government's sphere of competence will be defined on the basis of what it would or would not be useful for government to do or not do. government's limit of competence will be bounded by the utility of governmental intervention. The question addressed to government at every moment of its action and with regard to each of its institutions, old or new, is it useful? For what is it useful? Within what limits is it useful? When does it stop being useful? When does it become harmful? This is not the revolutionary question. What are my original rights and how can I assert them against any sovereign? But it is the radical question, the question of English radicalism. The problem of English radicalism is the problem of utility. Don't think that English political radicalism is no more than the projection of a utilitarian ideology on the level of politics. It is rather an attempt to define the sphere of competence of government in terms of utility on the basis of an internal elaboration of governmental practice, which is nevertheless fully thought through and always endowed and permeated with philosophical, theoretical, and juridical elements. In this respect, utilitarianism appears as something very different from a philosophy or an ideology. Utilitarianism is a technology of government, just as public law was the form of reflection, or, if you like, the juridical technology with which one tried to limit the unlimited tendency of raison d'etat. A comment with regard to this word radicalism or radical. The word radical, which I think dates from the end of the 17th and the start of the 18th century, was employed in England to designate, and it is this that is quite interesting, the position of those who, faced with the sovereign's real or possible abuses, wanted to assert those famous original rights supposedly possessed by the Anglo-Saxons prior to the Norman invasion. I talked about this 2 or 3 years ago. This is radicalism. So it consisted in the assertion of original rights in the sense of basic rights identified by the historical reflections of public law. However, for English radicalism, radical designates a position which involves continually questioning government and governmentality in general as to its utility or non-utility. So there are two approaches. The revolutionary approach, basically structured around traditional positions of public law, and the radical approach, basically structured around the new economy of government reason. These two approaches imply two conceptions of the law. In the revolutionary axiomatic approach, the law will be seen as the expression of a will. So there will be a system of will law. The problem of the will is, of course, at the heart of all the problems of right, which again confirms the fact that this is a fundamentally juridical problematic. The law is therefore conceived as the expression of a collective which will indicating the right of the law is therefore conceived as the expression of a collective will indicating the part of right individuals have agreed to cede and the part they wish to hold on to. In the other problematic, the radical utilitarian approach, the law is conceived as the effect of a transaction that separates the sphere of intervention of public authorities from that of the individual's independence. This leads us to another distinction, which is also very important. On one side, you have a juridical conception of freedom. Every individual originally has in his possession a certain freedom, a part of which he will or will not cede. On the other side, freedom is not conceived as the exercise of some basic rights, but simply as the independence of the governed with regard to government. We have, therefore, two absolutely heterogeneous conceptions of freedom, one based on the rights of man, and the other starting from the independence of the governed. I am not saying that the two systems of the rights of man and of the independence of the governed do not intertwine, but they have different historical origins, and I think they are essentially heterogeneous or disparate. With regard to the problem of what are currently called human rights, we would only need to look at where, in what countries, how, and in what form these rights are claimed to see that at times the question is actually the juridical question of rights, and at others it is a question of this assertion or claim of the independence of the governed vis-a-vis governmentality. So we have two ways of constituting the regulation of public authorities by law. Two conceptions of the law and two conceptions of freedom. This ambiguity is a characteristic feature of, let's say, 19th and also 20th century European liberalism. When I say two routes, two ways, two conceptions of freedom and of law, I do not mean two separate, distinct, incompatible, contradictory, and mutually exclusive systems, but two heterogeneous procedures, forms of coherence, and ways of doing things. We should keep in mind that heterogeneity is never a principle of exclusion. It never prevents coexistence, conjunction, or connection. And it is precisely in this case, in this kind of analysis that we emphasize and must emphasize a non-dialectical logic if want to avoid being simplistic. For what is dialectical logic? Dialectical logic puts to work contradictory terms within the homogeneous. I suggest replacing this dialectical logic with what I would call a strategic logic. A logic of strategy does not stress contradictory terms within a homogeneity that promises their resolution in a unity. The function of strategic logic is to establish the possible connections between disparate terms which remain disparate. The logic of strategy is the logic of connections between the heterogeneous and not the logic of the homogeneision of the contradictory. The logic of strategy is the logic of connections between the heterogeneous and not the logic of the homogenization of the contradictory. So let's reject the logic of the dialectic and try to see this is what I will try to show in these lectures. The connections which succeeded in holding together and conjoining the fundamental axiomatic of the rights of man and the utilitarian calculus of the independence of the governed. I wanted to add something to this, but I think it would take too long. I will come back to it later. I would like to return for a moment to what I said at the start with regard to the market. And it is a point to which I will come back later. Still, just now I would like to stress that between these two heterogeneous systems, that of the revolutionary axiomatic of public law and the rights of man, and that of the empirical and utilitarian approach, which defines the sphere of independence of the governed on the basis of the necessary limitation of government. There is, of course, a ceaseless connection and a whole series of bridges, transits, and joints. Consider the history of property rights, for example. But it is quite clear, I will talk about this in the lectures, that of the two systems, one has been strong and has held out while the other has receded. The one that has been strong and has stood fast is, of course, the radical approach, which tried to define the juridical limitation of public authorities in terms of governmental utility. These tendencies will characterize not only the history of European liberalism, strictly speaking, but the history of the public authorities in the West. Consequently, this problem of utility, of individual and collective utility, the utility of each and all, the utility of individuals and the general utility will be the major criteria for working out the limits of the powers of public authorities and the formation of a form of public law and administrative law. Since the beginning of the 19th century, we have been living in an age in which the problem of utility increasingly encompasses all the traditional problems of law. So on the basis of this, I would like to make a remark. With regard to the market, we found that one of the points of anchorage of the new governmental reason was an understanding of the market as a mechanism of exchange and a site of veridiction regarding the relationship between value and price. Now we find a second point of anchorage of the new governmental reason. This is the elaboration of the powers of public authorities and the measure of their interventions by reference to the principle of utility. So we have exchange on the side of the market and utility on the side of the public authorities. Exchange value and spontaneous veridiction of economic processes, measures of utility and internal jurisdiction of acts of the public authorities, exchange for wealth and utility for the public authorities. This is how governmental reason articulates the fundamental principle of its self-limitation. Exchange on one side and utility on the other. Obviously, the general category covering both or for thinking both. That is, exchange must be respected in the market, since the market is veridiction, and utility to limit the power of the public authorities, since it must only be exercised where it is positively and exactly useful, is, of course, interest, since interest is the principle of exchange, and interest is the criterion of utility. Governmental reason in its modern form, in the form established at the beginning of the 18th century, with the fundamental characteristic of a search for the principle of its self-limitation, is a reason that functions in terms of interest. But this is no longer the interest of an entirely self-referring state, which only seeks its own growth, wealth, population, and power, as was the state of raison d'etat. In the principle to which governmental reason must conform, interest is now interests, a complex interplay between individual and collective interests, between social utility and economic profit, between the equilibrium of the market and the regime of public authorities, between basic rights and the independence of the governed. Government at any rate, government in this new governmental reason, is something that works with interests. More precisely, we can say that it is through interests that government can get a hold on everything that exists for it in the form of individuals, actions, words, wealth, resources, property, rights, and so forth. We can put this more clearly, if you like, with a very simple question. On what did the sovereign, the monarch, the state have a hold in the previous system? And on what was its right to exercise this hold based, legitimized, and founded? It was things, lands. The king was often, not always, considered to be the owner of the realm. And it was as such that he could intervene, or at any rate, he owned an estate. He could exercise a hold over the subjects, since, as subjects, they had a personal relation to the sovereign that meant that whatever the rights of the subjects themselves, he could exercise a hold over everything. In other words, there was a direct hold of power in the form of the sovereign, in the form of his ministers, a direct hold of government over things and people. On the basis of the new governmental reason, and this is the point of separation between the old and the new, between raison d'etat and reason of the least state. Government must no longer intervene, and it no longer has a direct hold on things and people. It can only exert a hold. It is only legitimate, founded in law and reason, to intervene insofar as interest or interests, the interplay of interests, make a particular individual, thing, good, wealth, or process of interest for individuals, or for the set of individuals, or for the interest of a given individual faced with the interest of all, etc. Government is only interested in interests. The new government, the new governmental reason, does not deal with what I would call the things in themselves of governmentality, such as individuals, things, wealth, and land. It no longer deals with these things in themselves. It deals with the phenomena of politics, that is to say, interests, which precisely constitute politics and its stakes. It deals with interests, or that respect in which a given individual, thing, wealth, and so on interests other individuals or the collective body of individuals. I think we have a striking example of this in the penal system. I have tried to show how in the penal system of the 17th century and still at the start of the 18th century, basically when the sovereign punished, he intervened himself. And this was the true reason for the torture and execution. He intervened individually, so to speak, or any way as the sovereign, but physically on the individual's body, and this gave him the right of public torture and execution. It was the manifestation of the sovereign himself over someone who had committed a crime and who, by committing a crime, had of course wronged some people, but above all had struck the sovereign in the very body of his power. This was the site of the formation, justification, and even foundation of public torture and execution. From the 18th century, the well-known principle of mildness or of punishment appears. You can see it very clearly in Beccaria, which once again was not the expression of something like a change in people's sensibility. If you wanted to analyze it better than I have done, on what was this moderation of punishments based? Something is interposed between the crime on the one hand and the sovereign authority with the right to punish, possibly with death on the other. This is the thin phenomenal theme of interests, which henceforth is the only thing on which governmental reason can have a hold. As a result, punishment appeared as having to be calculated in terms of the injured party's interests, in terms of redress for damages, etc. Punishment will be rooted only in the play of the interests of others, of the family circle, of society, and so on. Is it worthwhile punishing? What interest is there in punishing? What form must punishment take for it to be in society's interests to punish? Is there an interest in torturing? Or is it more worthwhile to re-educate? And if so, how and up to what point? How much will it cost? The insertion of this thin, phenomenal film of interest as the only sphere, or rather, as the only possible surface of government intervention, is what explains these changes, all of which must be referred back to this reorganization of governmental reason. In its new regime, government is basically no longer to be exercised over subjects and other things subjected through these subjects. Government is now to be exercised over what we could call the phenomenal republic of interests. The fundamental question of liberalism is, what is the utility value of government and all actions of government in a society where exchange determines the true value of things? I think this question encapsulates the fundamental questions raised by liberalism. With this question, liberalism posed the fundamental question of government, which is whether all the political, economic, and other forms which have been contrasted with liberalism can really avoid this question and avoid formulating this question of the utility of a government in a regime where exchange determines the value of things. Okay, that is the end of lecture 2 from the 17th of January 1979 at the Collège de France by Michel Foucault.